different time zones and taking time out of their own complicated, busy jobs to talk to us. So for 4 years or so in the United States, we have been talking about how unprecedented everything is. The extreme political polarization, the deep distrust in the news media, a rise in militia activity and political violence. We're coming up against what is sure to be a high conflict election with probably disputed results, delayed outcomes, and likely an uptick in violence. This is all very disturbing on many levels as an American, as a reporter here, as a citizen. It's also not unprecedented. In fact, things like this have happened all over the world. And so I find when I don't know what to do, it's good to talk to people who have seen this before in different forms and try to learn from them. So I'm very grateful to have our panelists here. Before I introduce each of them, which I'm excited to do, I'm going to ask the audience for just a blanket patience. Wi-Fi is a little unreliable in some parts of the world that we're joined by here today. So it is possible we will lose video at some point. We will try to keep audio, but we'll all just be flexible with that. We will definitely have time for Q&A. So please add your questions to the chat box as they come to you. And I'm going to ask the panelists for forgiveness, because the truth is we can't do justice to any of these countries or the depth and breadth of the news media landscape in each of your countries in the time that we have here. It's a little audacious just to be dealing with as many places as we are in one conversation. But I think we can see helpful patterns and help us journalists here in the United States see outside of our own kind of rabbit hole, right? Sometimes it's easier to see yourself from afar and through analogies and patterns. So the first thing I want to do before we start the conversation with some questions is to introduce you to our panelists. Patricia Torres is here. You want to give us a wave, Patricia? Patricia is here from Caracas, Venezuela. And she has been a reporter and editor for local and international outlets for, I think, over 15 years, including AFP and The Guardian and The New York Times she's written for. She's covered, I think, over 10 elections in Venezuela. So that's a lot of experience. Many of you know that Venezuela was once one of the most respected democracies in the world. It became hyper polarized about 20 years ago, give or take, under the charismatic populist leadership of Hugo Chavez. And since he died in 2013, his successor, Maduro, has presided over a period of extreme economic distress with the highest inflation in the world. And there are severe limits on the freedom of the press. So we're especially grateful to Patricia for joining us. Lots of parallels there, which we will get to. And then we have Zafar, Zafar Sobhan is the editor-in-chief of the Dhaka Tribune in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is, I'm always amazed, like, it's just a huge country, like 162 million people. I was there years ago, but it was only for like 2 nights on a press tour, and I would love to go back, but it's just a fascinating place, ethnically homogenous, I believe, but still lots of conflict in recent years. It is a democracy, but the democracy has been under threat for some time now, a sort of steady increase of authoritarian tactics by the government, including intimidation, violence, crackdown on press freedom. And we will also talk more about all of that, but we're very grateful to Zafar for being here, who has a lot of experience as a journalist, as a columnist, as a reporter, an editor, has lived in the United States for some time as well. And then we have Joseph Jimmy Sankaituah, who is joining us from Sierra Leone. He is the country director for Search for Common Ground in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And Search for Common Ground is a conflict transformation NGO that works in 36 different countries. So in a lot of countries, like Sierra Leone and Liberia, NGOs like that work hand in hand with journalists much more closely than they would in the United States. So Jimmy routinely trains journalists for elections, supports their coordination on election day. And the very cool thing that Search for Common Ground does is they work with not just straight journalism, but all kinds of things, soap operas, sports messages, a very kind of creative and wide breadth of what media is. So we're very grateful to have Jimmy here with us as well.
Thank you.
Sierra Leone is a country of 7 million people, had a significant civil war from, I believe, 91 to 2002, if I have that right. And Liberia also had a civil war. It's about 5 million people bordering Sierra Leone. And it had its own civil war in the 1980s. But it's also, both countries have very deep and interesting historical ties to the United States because of the history of the slave trade. Liberia's government, I believe, was sort of modeled after the United States government. And so it's very familiar in some ways. So we have lots to talk about there as well. I would like to start, if I could, by asking a question to Patricia. I just wonder, and this is like the question I would ask you if I ran into you at like a hotel lobby bar, right, after we'd been covering something, right? I would ask, like, when you see the headlines here, when you see the headlines coming out of the United States, what comes to mind? Does this feel familiar to you? Like, what are some of the thoughts that come into your head?
Okay, well, hello, good morning, and thank you, well, for this invitation. I'm really humbled to be sharing my experience with you today. Well, Amanda and everybody, nowadays when I read headlines and stories from the United States about what's going on in these weeks before the elections, for me, it's like a flashback. It's like, you know, watching a movie again. And it's really amazing. And it wonders me because the last 20 years could happen in the United States. Because when you think of the United States, you think, you know, about a very strong democracy with very strong institutions. The democracy of like Taiwan, you know, that was still growing. But now I realize that it's not like that because the rhetoric there, the art, it's exactly the same we have lived here in Venezuela for the last 20 years. So what I'm learning is that people are the same everywhere. And I think it seems silly, but I think that if we understand that, we can learn, we can start from that point, especially when you do journalism, because it's just people we are living with. The other thing I'm learning is that you can never take democracy for granted. And I think journalists and the media, we have to play a role in that, in defending, in protecting democracy. And I say this because now, when I started doing journalism, Venezuela was a democracy. It wasn't perfect, but I could ask and I could say whatever I wanted. There were plenty of outlets. I could go and work. Nowadays, there are not that many outlets, and I'm not allowed to say what I want to say. I'm not allowed to ask the questions I need to ask. And I realized that we got here because of the polarization of this behind us. And that's why I think it's really interesting and it's really important to address what's going on in the United States now.
Thank you, Patricia. I want to let you know that I turned off your video, not to be rude, but because you were breaking up a little bit, and I think it helped the audio. I don't know. I hope it did. I was able to hear you. I hope everyone else was. It sounded like that you felt
sorry,
like
we have the worst internet connection in the world, so maybe that's why.
No, we're doing great. We're doing great, all things considered so far. And it sounded like you were saying that, you know, if I understood you correctly, that when you see the headlines out of the United States today, it feels like a flashback, like a movie that you've seen before. And that it's also, it reminds you that there's a universality to some of this, right? That polarization, tribalism, these kinds of human behaviors, the exploitation of divisions by leaders, these are part of, like, I think what you're saying is it's part of being human, right? And so we can see that happening around the world. And that also you made this important point about how we can't take democracy for granted.
No.
I wonder, before I move on from that point, I think here in the US, I feel like all journalists hear that and they're like, that's true, like right on. But what does it mean to not take democracy for granted from a journalist's point of view, looking back on Venezuela's history? How do you, like, what's one example of the way journalists can help not take democracy for granted? I know that's a hard question.
Okay, I would say that in a way, as what I'm trying to say, it means that it's important to understand that democratic institutions are not perfect, and that you have to work with what you have at certain moment. That you cannot destroy what you have. I mean, that doesn't it's not working at certain moment doesn't mean that it's not useful, it's not necessary. To find common grounds to stand for democratic institutions. If, like, here in Venezuela, it's like, I remember during elections, there was always distrust in the electoral authorities. And political leaders use this to inflict fear in people. And by that way, they managed to make a lot of people to show to vote. That was a personal agenda, but really at institutions, and they were doing their job. They were trying they were like working for personal interest, but the majority of the people, the institute itself, was trying to help our elections.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt you, Patricia. I'm sorry. You're breaking up a little, and I want to make sure everyone heard what you said, because I think it's important.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think I'm
try changing my connection, you know, because I think I can get a better one.
Okay. In the meantime, I think I can summarize. You tell me if I got this right or wrong, but I think what you're saying is one way to not take democracy for granted is realize that it's imperfect. But when it is functioning, don't assume that it's broken, right? Like sometimes democracy is messy and slow, but leaders, conflict entrepreneur leaders will sometimes exploit distrust for election processes, right? And that's something that happened in Venezuela. It's happening in the United States. So there's a lot of distrust among the public for the process, for the election, the voting machines, I think it was in Venezuela. Here it's with the mail-in ballots and other things. But in fact, a lot of people, were trying to just do their jobs, and it was imperfect. Do I have that? Do I have that right?
Yeah. That's exactly what the point I want to make. Yes, that it's important to work with the institutions, to find out what they're doing. It's not just to launch a war against the system for the sake of it. I mean, we have to work with the institutions we have. We have to give people information for them to trust the process. And if they don't trust it, we have to give them tools to improve it and to gain trust.
By the way, you sound beautiful. So whatever you did, that was fantastic. And I think this is an excellent point. Sometimes I know here, everybody thinks every story is Watergate, right? Like there's a good guy and a bad guy, and we're going to take him down. And there's like a sort of adversarial lens through which we do a lot of journalism, even when, in fact, 99% of the time, the problems are complicated. There's sort of system level problems. They're problems of complacency, bureaucracy, incompetence, as opposed to villainy. So that's a really good point. I want to move to Zafar because Patricia sort of teed up this point that the process is really important, and it's important that journalists and the public understand the process before an election. You said something when we talked on the phone earlier a few weeks ago that the run up to an election is almost as important as the election itself. Zafar, can you talk about that and how you work with your own reporters and your newsroom? What would you be doing, less than a month away from an election like this?
Sure. Thank you very much, Amanda. I think actually in the context of this election, which is coming up in November in the US, it's all the more important because I think it's really very clear. I mean, I think we have about 3 weeks left, what the game plan is going to be. And I think a lot of people at the voter level, at the civilian level, at the layperson level, are not necessarily so familiar with what the rules of the game are. And they don't necessarily understand how things have changed so dramatically. I think what we're used to, certainly in the US context, is that election night, people are expecting to have a president announced, a winner. And I think with the wide use of mail order ballots this time in the US, that's kind of unlikely to happen. It may still happen, but it's less likely. And of course, we need to then understand, what does that mean? I think the media playbook, which Election SOS put together, which you put together, is really, really excellent. I think it kind of makes this point in terms of how we need to manage expectations and explain to people just how different this is. I mean, one of the things when I was preparing for this and trying to figure out what I wanted to say to American journalists and reporters who are covering it, I think there are two things. I mean, first, when we think in terms of election coverage, you have to look in terms of the reporters who are going to be there on the ground and what their reality is. And so that's one element of it. And then, of course, the editors who are either going to be in the newsroom or the studio and, what their context is going to be. These are sort of two fairly separate things. And the other thing is, as you mentioned, to divide it into the election run-up, before the election, during the election, and after the election. We need to really plan for all three of these phases very, very carefully. And of course, the pre-election phase, the before-election phase has already started. And I think what we really need to do at this stage before an election is context. Explain to everyone the context of what is going on. For instance, I read about in Texas, I think drop-off locations for absentee ballots, there's now one per district, regardless of how many people are in the district. And to provide that context to people who are going to be either reading the news or watching the news, and explaining really what are the implications of that. I think on election day, we need to be able to tell people and make sense of what they're seeing. So, how long are the lines? How many people typically vote at a given polling center? You can estimate these things, hour by hour. How many people are voting this time? Is there going to be an issue with how late the polling center is going to be allowed to be open? What are the implications? What are the laws? I mean, I think so many of the laws surrounding elections in America are actually quite arcane, and they vary from state to state. Sometimes they might even vary at a more granular level than that. And I think it's really important to try and explain to people going in beforehand what the rules of the game are. This is something you mentioned in the playbook. I mean, oftentimes, a lot of inefficiency we're going to see does not necessarily mean that that's an irregularity. There's going to be inefficiency. There's going to be, all kinds of, I don't know, you could call it sort of democratic dysfunction. But, we have to be able to differentiate between the dysfunction, which is part of the system, and that which is actually new, that which is unprecedented, and that which is, really disrupting things and in many ways disfiguring the actual election process, which is something, elections have never been perfect, so even in America. But I think what we are fearing we may see is something quite unprecedented. And I think, and this is the point Patricia made, that, of course you're going to see minor problems. What we need to be able to do is to differentiate between the minor problems which we've seen before, but which is something which we can all live with, and really be prepared for the fact that if things go beyond a certain level, that takes us into uncharted territory in terms of covering elections. It takes this election into uncharted territories, and that story needs to be told to the voting public, to the general audience, the readers, whoever they might be.
Yeah, this is actually a really big thing, right? Like, it's complicated. We could have like hours of conversation about this. Like, how do you give the viewers or your readers or listeners a sense of perspective of the denominator, right? Like, this is something I think we are really bad at least here. And it was very obvious. It's been very obvious during the pandemic. Like every day on the radio, I hear how many new infections there are without any denominator or any sense of trend, which is innumerate, right? Like, that's totally unhelpful in every way. So doing the same thing with the elections is not going to work. But the challenge, right, is it sounds like you spend a lot of time with your reporters prepping for probability and numbers and what data, like what happened last time in this polling place, right?
Yeah, that's the only way you can really make sense of it all. And, you have to actually prep for a worst case scenario, because of course, let's imagine everything goes well, fantastic, nothing like it. But the prep has to say, okay, well, what if this happens? What are we going to do then? And I think what's really important in terms of setting expectations, preparing the ground, is telling a cohesive story to your readers or your viewers. There has to be continuity. You can't just switch up the narrative all of a sudden. So, you can't be reporting one story up until 6 p.m. and then all of a sudden you realize, you kind of got the story wrong, or that there's been stuff you haven't reported. Then that completely will destroy the credibility of all of your reporting on the ground, of what you're doing. And it'll, in fact, that's damaging, of course, to your credibility as a news organization. But more to the point, I think that will then contribute to throwing the entire election into more confusion, which is really kind of what no one wants. I think what's really important at this stage is for us to think in terms of, what we're doing as journalists kind of as a public service, okay? And, so looking at the big picture of what we're trying to do, and, you've mentioned this in terms of, one of the things I would suggest is that coordination is key. And so, of course, if you're a reporter on the ground, you're going to be coordinating with your editor, your newsroom, whoever that might be. You're going to be coordinating with your other colleagues who are also on the ground at different polling centers. But I think it's also important to coordinate with other reporters who are working for other media outlets. And there are three reasons for this. One is for safety. Okay, and I mean, maybe that's overstated in the American context, we don't know, but it's certainly something in Bangladesh we care about greatly, is the safety of our reporters. Two, you can also get ideas and spot trends. And three, they can help you confirm what you're seeing on the ground. And I think it's really key, and I don't know if this is going to fly with your bosses, but what we do here in Bangladesh is on election day, we have no competitors, okay? The idea is we think the media really should try to the extent possible to report as one. And so we really try and have one another's backs. It's not about getting the scoop. It's not about getting the story no one else gets. If you get a story, you want to try and confirm it with other people, because more important than my newspaper getting the scoop is I want to make sure that this election is robust. And the way we do that is actually by cooperating with each other in a way we might not normally do during normal times. So that's how we do it here. I'm not sure to what extent that's a practical piece of advice in the American context, but I do actually think it, if you look at it from that perspective, and you look at it in terms of your job is not to, get the best story for my newspaper. Your job is to really try and report the best you can do for the whole nation, okay? That if you kind of approach it from that mindset, that actually could be a very useful frame with which to look at the election.
Zafar, I think that's a great point, and really resonates with something that I want to ask Jimmy about. It is the kind of thing where in the United States, we don't have nonpartisan election observers as like a system. Like that's not something we really have. We have the media, and unfortunately, particularly local newspapers, but also other media outlets have been under, severe financial distress. So that whole kind of network is frayed and often absent. So really the only way to serve that role is through cooperation, is through a network effect. Jimmy said something to me when we talked about one journalist alone can't do anything. You have to create a network. Jimmy, can you talk to us a little bit about what that looks like, maybe with the International Radio Network, where you are, and how you work with journalists to create that network, particularly around elections? Jimmy, you are muted. If you could just... There we go.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be able to share this platform with all of you. The issues about elections coverage in a very difficult environment requires some unprecedented sacrifices that media institutions need to make. There is no way that we can compromise the safety and security of the state because we want to keep our independence. So here, most often we have challenges of this nature. All media institutions would agree to put aside their independence largely and work together for the safety of the state. Because if the country gets into chaos, no media institution will have the adequate space to report. And so working together as media institutions can be a powerful way to defeat the forces of evil. And so what we've done over the years is to build a strong network, create a brand throughout the country that the entire population can rely on for elections coverage. In the context of the United States, I know it's a vast country with so many differences, so many perspectives, but for the sake of these elections and the situation confronting the entire country, there is no doubt that one of the ways to help salvage a situation is for media institutions to be more complementary than trying to compete, because competition at this point will not help the United States. It is media institutions working together to complement where others have gaps, those who have strength can fill in that gap. Whether local or national media institutions, they need to come together to work for the good of the United States than trying to compete, because competition, in my view, will make things worse than it will help to forge a stable and peaceful society.
That makes so much sense to me. And it's interesting that you're both saying the same thing in two very different places. Jimmy, can you walk me through, do you set up a sort of situation room with journalists during the election? I think the radio network is what, like 30 different radio stations?
Yeah, there are 40 national and community radio stations. So the way it works is that first, all of those 40 community and national radio stations have a code of practice that bound them together in terms of what they cover and how they cover the elections. So we had close to 400 election reporters trained and deployed across the entire country. Because for us to inspire citizens' confidence in the electoral process, we have to inform them step by step as events unfold, that we do not miss out on any important event as the election process unfolds from the start of the elections, as early as our ballots are being deployed to polling centers. Our reporters are there. They pick up the story, and there's a team in studio that is analyzing what is happening across the entire country, and all the radio stations are hooked up to a single network to simulcast what is happening across the country. So people in one part of the region will know exactly what is happening in another part of the region because there's a reporter there giving them information. And so when people get to appreciate what is happening across the country in terms of keeping the peace, maintaining the process, being included into the process, they get hope that they have a responsibility to make sure that their part of the country remains stable. So for that level of networking, it requires a lot of human resource capital to be invested into it. So to drive us to be able to achieve that, when we deployed journalists across the country, we make sure they have all the equipment they need to be able to provide us the information, but also it's quite important to make sure that they are adequately trained, they understand the context, they understand the issues, and they are reporting because they have a responsibility to report factually about what is happening in their area. Because whatever the information they provide is going across the entire country. And if one person anywhere challenges the validity of what they are reporting, undermines the credibility of the entire process. So we are making sure to deploy journalists that are credible, that are not do not have biases along the way, but also making sure that we are deploying people not necessarily in their own region. We're deploying people across different regions, so that you are not very familiar with the region you are deployed in, so it doesn't undermine your credibility or your desire to be fair about what you report. So all of those simple things that we might be looking down upon are quite important when it comes to crisis reporting in this context.
That's fascinating. And one of the strengths, I think, from what you told me of Sierra Leone and Liberia and other countries is that there are trusted news outlets still that are trusted by all sides, right?
Oh, very much. So there's a common signature tune. Once citizens hear that signature tune, they know that yes, we are about to hear exactly what we want to hear about what's going on. And so it takes time to build trust. So with a long period of time, doing exactly what citizens trust that we can do has helped us to build credibility with citizens. And so when we're about to start to do elections coverage, we focus on our own credibility as institutions, but also the credibility of what we are reporting across the entire country. Because if we don't do that, and citizens lose confidence in what we do today, it will impact on the next elections. In the case of the United States, I think this will be happening for the first time. All I can say to them is to think about country first, and to think about country first means that you have to give some of your independence to be able to sustain the stability of the country. And to do that, it means that each media institution will have to try as much as possible to participate in a network, in a network of media institutions dedicated to covering the electoral process in a way that increases the credibility of the elections in the eyes of the population.
Yeah, because go ahead, Patricia.
No, I just want to point out, I think what Jim is saying is very important. I think especially on election day, it is important for journalists not to rush. I mean, on election day, it's not about who's the first, who has the result, who is going to get the scoop. No, it's about getting facts right. I remember once I had in a very, I think it was in 2015, in the Venezuelan last parliamentary elections. I remember I got the results in advance. I was at that night, at that day, I was working for the New York Times. And I got the result, but just from one source. And before the day, I mean, we made clear that we needed at least 3 sources to confirm any kind of like sensitive information. And I have a very good source, but it wasn't enough. And we were not the first to give the results, but when we gave the result, we gave them right. And I think it's very important not to rush. I mean, election day, it's a day for verifying facts, for giving people information, not opinions. It's not for guessing. People are going to be waiting for facts, for information. And we have the responsibility to build that trust, as Jimmy said.
And I can only add that maybe this singular electoral process or process leading to the elections could be an opportunity for US media to regain the trust of the public. They could take unprecedented actions to allow this opportunity of a deepening crisis in the United States to report in a way that allow them to regain the trust of the public.
What's so interesting is I hear in all of your comments a sort of underlying theme about the identity of journalists around fragile elections, like that part of your job is to protect democracy and order. That is not something that American journalists are used to sort of thinking of themselves that way. You know what I mean? Like, and it makes a lot of sense. And I find myself envious, Jimmy, that you have a brand, even a jingle, like a slogan that people trust, you know, that people from all sides trust. We no longer have any single news outlet that people from all sides trust. We can argue about that in the chat box, but certainly not at the national level. I don't think we do. And I don't think we're nearly as upset about it as we should be. That is something that I think editors should be deeply concerned about. And I love this idea of cooperating. There are local newspapers that have started doing this before because they couldn't cover, all of upstate New York because they just didn't have the budget anymore. So they've started pooling some of their resources, and hopefully that will be helpful during the election. And I agree, Jimmy, there's a huge opportunity here. We desperately need to rebuild trust among the public. There's no facts, there's no democracy if you cannot trust at least one media outlet that everyone can sort of more or less think is at least trying to tell the truth. So many things I want to ask, but I want to take what Patricia said about election day is not for being first or fast, and turn back to Zafar and ask about rumors. So rumors all over the world. This is another human universality, I think. All over the world, from Chicago to Dhaka to Caracas, rumors spread very fast on social media. They don't need to be true to be believed, particularly in polarized countries. And that is usually often how violence begins, right? And once you begin a cycle of violence, then the other side takes revenge. And then next thing you know, you're voting for a strongman ruler because everybody's frightened, right? And next thing you know, you don't have freedom of the press and other things. I'm kind of exaggerating, but you get the idea. So Zafar, how do you deal with, I think you mentioned that a couple of years ago, maybe it was the 2018 election in Bangladesh, there were protests and there was rumors flying around on social media about that protesters had been killed and maybe a female protester had been raped, I believe. How did you deal with that in your newsroom? How did you hear of it? What do you do in that situation?
Sure. That was actually not around an election. That was around these protests, which had been, roiling the city for a couple of days. And then, the government had decided they had had enough. I mean, I think, and this is, again, this really speaks to what Patricia and Jimmy were both saying, is that the problem with rumor fueled journalism, or the reason rumors, somehow take hold so quickly, even among mainstream media outlets, is because of the pressure to be first. We don't want anyone else to get the news. Other people are reporting it. Oh my gosh, we need this story. And then what happens when you have that pressure to be first is that then the normal avenues of fact checking, which you normally have in place, the gatekeeping, which all responsible media organizations have in place, you tend sometimes to sort of reduce those safeguards. And certainly, now with the internet, the temptation to do that is really great. And I think that's actually what has happened. So people are always wanting to be first, and that's why sometimes they go and they sort of undermine their own standards. So again, the solution to all of this is to remember that on election day, it's not about being first. Okay? If your focus is on being first, if your focus is that I need to break this story, you're always going to be vulnerable to being hoaxed. You're always going to be vulnerable to rumors driving your coverage, which is exactly what you don't want to do. What you need to do on election day is you need to slow down. You cannot let your news judgment be impacted by what other people are reporting. And especially, we do see this because we live in the age of internet, we live in the age of Twitter. There are always going to be, people making claims on social media, and sometimes even your competitors, even other newspapers or other television stations might be out there. You need to be able to have that clarity of vision to hold back and say, look, it is so important on this day of all days to make sure that every single fact is double checked, triple checked, quadruple checked. Anything we put out on this day must be correct. And like I said, it could be other people will get that scoop. They will beat you to the story. I think you have to just, if you take the decision in advance that this isn't what it's going to be about, that your goal is to really shore up the democratic process rather than try and make sure that you're first to the story, that will probably be the safeguards you need to make sure you don't make these mistakes. Because rumors at any time, when they can spread like wildfire, and they can be very, very dangerous and disruptive. And we've seen a lot of that in the Bangladeshi context. You mentioned one example, and there have been a number of others. But the destructive potential for rumors is magnified vastly in the volatile environment of an election. So we really have to be incredibly careful.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, you can even give wings to a rumor without necessarily having any negative intention. Because many people, of course, who spread the rumors do. with a negative intention. They have an agenda, and and of course, that's a huge problem. But you can also fan the fires without even knowing that you're doing it, and without even intending to do it. So you have to be very careful. But slow it down.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, and it's so interesting because I think, again, this idea that part of our job is to shore up democracy. I think American journalists have started to get that, but we don't always know how to do it, right? So like I have colleagues who think the way to shore up democracy is to produce a daily count of how many lies President Trump has told, right? Which is fair, right? But it doesn't actually have the purpose that you want it to have. It's important to note these things, but it doesn't actually shore up democracy, sadly, in a polarized climate. Whereas slowing down your coverage, coordinating with other media outlets, those kinds of things can shore up democracy from what you all are telling me. I want to go to Jimmy, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So people listening, please, so I see at least one or two good questions in here. Please submit more questions in the chat box if you've got them. But Jimmy, I want to go to the 2018 Sierra Leone election as an example. If I have this right, none of the candidates reached the 55% threshold. So it went to a second round sort of runoff. And then the results were delayed because of disagreements about how the votes were going to be counted. So in some ways, a dicey situation where you have uncertainty, fears that things are not going well. How did journalists handle that in that context? Are there any lessons learned from there with regard to rumors or coordination or other things?
Yes. So first, I think I'll correct that the election was within legal time frame. So the law requires that after the election, during the runoff, there's a particular period that is required for that runoff to take place, and it took place within that time frame. What actually happened was that while the first round result was quite close between the two leading candidates, there was a huge coordination between media institutions and civil society organizations. So in as much as there were about 400 media journalists deployed across the country, there was also 10,400 civil society election observers deployed across the country as independent election observers. So all of that further heightened and increased the credibility of the electoral process. And so because there were one civil society person deployed to each polling center across the entire country, whatever information coordinating with the media institutions were being reported, people take it to be true because their eyes were present at the polling center. They knew that politicians would not manipulate the outcome of the elections because there were civil society people there. So they trusted that huge number of individuals deployed across the country. So why they might not even have trusted the elections management body, why they might not have even trusted the politicians, but they trusted that they are of faith, civil society of faith, elections journalists were across the entire country, keeping eyes on the entire process and coordinating with elections management body. Those are very important, of faith that help sustain and increase the credibility of the election in the eyes of the population. Because during the elections, while politicians are quite important, but citizen trust become more important than the politicians because they are the ones whose perception about the outcome of the election matters. If, for example, the entire region rejects the outcome of the elections, we are in trouble. So to be able to inspire the confidence of everyone who has interest in the process is quite important. And so even though the outcome of the final result was quite tight, I think 3 plus or minus 3% difference between the winner and the loser in the second round. But because civil society and media institutions were quite involved, quite active, ensuring that the process continues to be credible from start to finish. I recall there was a time where civil society had to deploy individuals at the airport, so that when the ballot papers arrive, they were accompanying the ballot papers from the airport straight to the elections office where the ballot papers will be kept. They remain there overnight. and they accompanied the ballot papers to the polling centers. They did the same back to where the elections, where the final tally were taking place. So all of that helped to increase the confidence of citizens in the electoral process, and that helped also overcome the. It's unprecedented here in this part of the world, where you have a elections result margin of about 34%, and the loser accept the result. It's quite difficult to believe, but it happened because they knew that the process was policed by civil society and the media throughout.
So it sounds like the news media not only cooperated, but you also linked arms with civil society organizations to dramatically, geometrically expand the reach and credibility. That's fascinating. I want to go to my friend and colleague, Helene Biandudi-Hofer, who has a question. She says, this is absolutely fascinating, Jimmy, and something that our competitive media outlets in the US would greatly benefit from. How were you able to get media institutions to buy into this concept, to understand it's about country first? In other words, there wasn't always, I assume, trust in these outlets. So you built that, which I think is really important to see that arc. How did you build it?
So first, Search for Common Ground has been working with media institutions for about 20 years since we've been in Sierra Leone. And we helped to set up some of those media institutions, especially community-based organizations. And we knew as a post-conflict country, for us to be able to continue to make the difference in the electoral process and support democracy, we needed to make sure we bring people together, because we knew there is strength in working together. And so we've always, sold to media institutions the benefit for working together. So coming together to develop common code of ethics, coming together to take on, for example, we will all broadcast this single radio program on every Thursday at 1 a.m. or 1 p.m. was an important way to begin to let people see the benefit for coming together. So this has been since after the civil crisis, over 15, 16, 17 years of investment in media institutions working together. So the brand we have in Sierra Leone is not a brand that came up in 2018. It's a brand that over a long period of time, it has been growing and growing, and the population has been trusting it. And we've kept that brand quite secret, quite sacred. We made it our business to ensure that brand, that the authority of that brand does not get undermined, that we all work together to keep it intact, that we own this, is ours, and we must work hard to make sure that it remains credible in the eyes of the public. So it's a years of investment.
So it's like it almost became a point of pride to know that you're trusted by different sides, and then you defend that, right? And so I love, you told me a story, which, maybe we'll have time to get into later. I want to go to the next question, but you told me a story about, I think it was Radio Democracy had a political leader on who was making unverified, unproven claims about votes not being counted correctly in the North. And they just shut the microphone off.
Oh, yes.
And they just said, there's no evidence for that. Yeah. And the guy left, and, oh my God, I would love for that to happen. But you got to get to a place where you can do that and you're trusted enough, because if you do that now here, you're just seen as hugely biased. And I'm sure that happens there as well. But
let's bear in mind that all of this came out of after the experience we have with the crisis. Right. And so the US, based on this experience, can be a fundamental shift in how they deal with the media institutions moving forward.
Right, yeah. Right. This is the whole question. Can you be a post-conflict country without a civil war? Can you skip the civil war and realize the lessons of conflict without, it's sort of like with alcoholism. Where is bottom? You have to hit bottom. You can decide where bottom is. It doesn't mean you're in the grave necessarily. But can we get our minds, can we broaden our imagination? And that's why it's so helpful to hear from you all, so that we can sort of move forward without having to really burn down the house, right? I want to go to a question from Jane Recker. I feel like many of the areas where we're most concerned about election interference are also news deserts, places where we really don't have functioning news outlets. What responsibility do New York City and DC-based institutions have to ensure those areas are being covered as amply as American cities? That's a good question, because there are these vast parts of the country that just aren't covered, and then you have places that are over saturation covered because of where the big media markets are. Do people have thoughts on how you, in a large territory, how you deal with places where there just aren't media outlets? We've heard from Jimmy about the use of civil society organizations, which is like a term of art that we don't even have that term. But I think our term for it would be, nonprofits, right? And community organizations, everything from, churches to mosques to Kiwanis clubs to, community building, all kinds of community organizations. So any other thoughts about how you can do that when you don't have people on the ground?
I think from our experience, US is known for people volunteering to provide support to very difficult situations. And so that would be one way. But I think what they look forward to is someone to take leadership. If someone was to come out to say, look, we have the resources, we want to deploy people in this part of the country where there's no one telling us anything about what is happening there, I'm sure people will volunteer. If you give them the skills, they might be willing to go to those vast areas and provide information that the population needs. So it's just about an institution or individual stepping forward to say, look, this is about country, and we need to be able to contribute to move things. So who are those willing to step forward to provide support in this direction? I think people will be willing. We've seen that come in the US where people are always willing to step forward and support.
Well, that's a good point.
But someone has to lead.
Someone has to lead and give up some control, right? Like part of building trust with the public is deputizing the public, like trusting the public to serve in these roles. We know that one thing that does help us here in thinking about that is we know where the problems are going to be, right? We know where the swing states are. We know where there's been a lot of protests in the past. There's a great link to a map that the Bridging Divides Institute has that overlays violence in the United States and community building organizations, so the equivalent of civil society. I'll put that up in the chat, but that's a fantastic resource for journalists around the country to see what's happening where and have contacts there immediately. Another really helpful thing is that, when Zafar talked about the importance of understanding the process, right? And we're starting to get much more reporting about that here, about each state and different arcane processes. One thing we need more of is the process, the involvement of the military and of private unauthorized militia, right? So what we would refer to all over the world as paramilitary and private paramilitary organizations. We have these militia that you may have read about here. One thing that reporters and the public need to get much clearer on, and can in the next couple of weeks, are the laws surrounding this. So in fact, private militia are illegal in every state in the country unless they are activated by the governor. There's a great Georgetown University Institute that has put together fact sheets for all 50 states about this. This is the kind of thing you have to get out ahead, right? Of what, guys show up with, semi-automatic weapons at polling places. We need to know in advance, or at protests, what's legal, what's not. Call up the sheriff's department and say, doesn't this violate the law? Those are the things we have to know in advance. And I know in other countries, there would be much more reporting by now on the loyalty and affiliations of military generals, I believe, and chiefs of staff and that sort of thing. So that's another area of reporting that we could, I think, do better on in the weeks to come.
I'm sorry, if I could just
Go
say,
ahead. Yeah,
even
please.
at a more local level, I would imagine political affiliations or endorsements, if there are any, of local police chiefs, because at a very local level, law and order is going to be kept by the police administration. And so do they have a agenda? Do they have a bias? That's something. And then it's only if things really become bad that, then you'll move to look at sort of military chiefs, and it could end that way. Who knows? I mean, that's something we always care about here in Bangladesh. But I think at the very basic level, day-to-day law and order is going to be maintained on election day by the local police officials. And so we need to also understand whether, what role we can expect them to play, whether there are any areas of concern, among various departments.
That's That's a great point, Zafar. And also sheriffs, because we have large parts of the country that where sheriffs sometimes feel like they have a lot of autonomy. And it's important to do that reporting in advance about their past behavior and their allegiances, because you're right, they will be the first line of defense and maybe the second and third. I want to leave us with one last quick round of question. I know we need to wrap up, but I think it's easy to feel a little bit overwhelmed or hopeless. We have some disadvantages here, which we've talked about, but I think we also have some advantages here. Are there things like that we should be appreciating, like strengths we have going into this election as journalists in the United States that we can take advantage of, that might be harder to come by in other countries that we should mention, so we can go out on a on a hopeful note?
Well, I would say that, you're having an election, and that's great, because that's what democracy it's about. So you have a great opportunity to, tell people that what's going to happen on election date, it's a process that involves everyone, that it's not that it's a process of what you're going to do on that day. So it's a big opportunity, because you are you're going to elect your leader, and that's important. You have to, in a way, get rid of the fatalistic idea that something bad's going to happen. That it's good to be prepared. It's good, as Zafar said, to think of the scenarios. But just think that, it's going to be elections. You have held elections for over 200 years. So there's so many things you've learned from the past. You cannot throw that away. This is not the first election in the United States, and it's not going to be the last one either.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
It's not the end of the world. It's not the end one. It's never the end. It's just the beginning.
And we do still have quite a bit of press freedom here. I think the latest ranking of Reporters Without Borders put the United States at 45th out of 180 countries, which, could be better, but could be much, much worse. So we still do have a lot of press freedom here. And that's not a small thing, and something we need to protect, right, as we've discussed. I want to just quickly give a shout out to Helen, who is here from Solutions Journalism Network. They will be doing a training on Thursday that's open to the public, to journalists, for how to do election and political coverage in polarized climates when there's huge distrust. I highly recommend it. So check that out, the Solutions Journalism Network website. I'm also going to put up the map that I mentioned here that looks at tracks real-time election violence in the United States. Also, it's not something we have done. We don't track political violence in this country the way we fund other countries to do in their own country. So we're starting to see that. The International Crisis Group has this map, and Bridging Divides, Neil and Parker at Princeton has made this really cool map that overlays that data with localized data on what community organizations exist in each place. Super helpful for reporters. So I want to thank everyone so much for being here, for joining us. We're very grateful for this brain trust of people from around the world helping us think through and see what's happening, and not get too myopically focused on the specifics of the conflict, and to see the patterns, which are very universal. So thank you all so much. It's good to see you. Be well, be safe, and we appreciate your wisdom and time. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Oh, and this video will be available, guys, for anyone who wants to share it, or who has friends who missed this. I know I have a bunch of people emailed me, asked if they could see it later. So it will be available through Election SOS, and there's a ton of great resources up on that site. So please share them widely. And thank you all. Have a good rest of your day or nights, as the case may be. Take good care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.